Imagine you build your entire house on someone else's land. You pay them. You trust them. You build walls around your family using their bricks, their cement, their soldiers. And then one night, while your house is burning, you look around, and the person who was supposed to protect you is standing far away, watching, doing nothing. That is the moment Saudi Arabia lived through in September 2019. And that is the moment everything changed. Because what happened that night was not just an attack, it was a revelation. It was the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia waking up to a truth they had been ignoring for decades. The truth that no matter how many billions they spent on American weapons, no matter how many American bases sat on their soil, no matter how deep the relationship seemed on paper, when the fire came, America was not going to walk into the flames for them. And from that single night forward, Saudi Arabia made a decision that is now reshaping the entire military balance of the Middle East. They decided to stop trusting anyone but themselves. This is not a story about two countries falling out. This is not a story about diplomatic tension or political arguments. This is a story about one of the most powerful nations on earth quietly, carefully, and brilliantly dismantling 8 decades of military dependency and building something entirely new in its place. A military machine that answers to no one outside Riyadh. A defense structure that does not need Washington's permission. A kingdom that is no longer a client of American power, but is becoming a power of its own. And the most fascinating part of this story is that it is happening right now, in real time, while most of the world is not paying attention. The deals are being signed, the factories are being built, the alliances are being forged in places Washington never expected. So let us go back to where this really began. Let us understand exactly why Saudi Arabia is breaking free from American military influence, and why this changes everything. For 8 decades, the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States was built on one of the most straightforward deals in modern geopolitical history. Saudi Arabia had the oil, America had the weapons and the military muscle. Riyadh would keep the oil flowing, keep prices stable, and keep the region calm. Washington would protect the kingdom from its enemies, supply its army, train its soldiers, and make sure no hostile power could topple the House of Saud. It was a marriage of convenience that both sides needed badly. During the Cold War, this arrangement made perfect sense. Saudi Arabia sat on roughly 25% of the world's proven crude oil reserves. The Americans needed that oil flowing to their allies in Europe and Asia. The Soviets were probing the Middle East for influence. Having Saudi Arabia firmly in the Western camp was not just useful, it was essential. And so Washington provided military training missions as far back as the 1950s. By the time the 1991 Gulf War arrived, over 550,000 coalition troops were stationed inside Saudi Arabia, using Saudi bases, Saudi airfields, Saudi logistics to launch the campaign against Saddam Hussein. That was the peak of American military presence inside the kingdom. But even then, the seeds of resentment were already being planted. Because Saudi Arabia is not just any country. It is the birthplace of Islam. It is the land of Mecca and Medina, the 2 holiest sites in the entire Muslim world. And having hundreds of thousands of non-Muslim foreign soldiers stationed permanently inside that sacred land was deeply uncomfortable for millions of Saudis. The religious conservatives hated it. The nationalists hated it. And one Saudi-born man named Osama bin Laden made it the central grievance of his entire war against the West. His argument, however twisted and violent, resonated with enough people to make the American presence a genuine political liability for the Saudi royal family. By 2003, after the fall of Saddam Hussein, Saudi Arabia and the United States quietly agreed that it was time for American combat forces to leave Saudi soil. The relationship continued, the arms deals continued, the training cooperation continued, but the massive visible troop presence was gone. It looked like a mature adjustment between 2 allies. But underneath the surface, questions were already beginning to form in Riyadh. Questions about how reliable Washington truly was. Questions about whether America would always be there when it mattered most. Those questions got louder during the Arab Spring of 2011. Saudi Arabia watched as the Obama administration abandoned long-standing American allies in Egypt and Tunisia almost overnight, deciding that democratic movements mattered more than the stability of loyal partners. For the House of Saud, watching America drop Hosni Mubarak, a man who had served American interests for 30 years, after only days of street protest was deeply alarming. If Washington could abandon Mubarak that quickly, what did that mean for the Saudi royals themselves? The message seemed to be that America's friendship had conditions, and conditions could change. Then came the Iran nuclear deal in 2015. Saudi Arabia's most dangerous regional rival, the country they viewed as a direct existential threat, was being brought in from the cold by the Obama administration. From Riyadh's perspective, America was rewarding Iran with sanctions relief and international legitimacy, while Saudi Arabia, the loyal ally, was being left to watch its enemy grow stronger. The anger in the royal palace was barely contained. MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the young crown prince who was rapidly consolidating power, saw this as proof that Saudi Arabia could not afford to keep all its eggs in the American basket. But it was September 14, 2019, that turned strategic caution into strategic action. That morning, drone and cruise missile strikes hit the Abqaiq oil processing facility and the Khurais oil field. These were not small targets. Abqaiq was the single most important piece of oil infrastructure on the entire planet, processing roughly 7% of the world's daily oil supply. The attacks knocked out more than half of Saudi Arabia's oil production overnight. Fires burned at the facility for hours. Satellite images showed the scale of the destruction. It was the most devastating attack on global energy infrastructure in history. The Houthi rebels in Yemen claimed responsibility. The United States and Saudi Arabia pointed the finger at Iran, and the world held its breath waiting to see how Washington would respond to this attack on its closest Gulf ally. The response was nothing. No military strike, no retaliation against Iran, no dramatic show of force. President Trump said the United States was locked and loaded, but nothing followed. American officials quietly made clear they had no interest in being dragged into a war in the Gulf over Saudi oil. After years of hearing American guarantees, after decades of buying American weapons precisely to ensure this kind of protection, Saudi Arabia had just been attacked in the most spectacular and damaging way imaginable. And Washington essentially said this was not America's fight. That was the moment Mohammed bin Salman stopped believing in the American security umbrella. Not publicly, not dramatically, but the decision was made in those days after the Abqaiq attack. Saudi Arabia would never again bet its national survival on American willingness to come to its defense. The process of building strategic independence had already begun under Vision 2030, launched in 2016. But after Abqaiq, that process went from a long-term economic goal to an urgent national security imperative. Vision 2030 is the grand plan of MBS to transform Saudi Arabia from an oil-dependent economy into a diversified modern powerhouse. Most people know it as an economic project. The tourism push, the entertainment sector, NEOM, the futuristic megacity. But buried inside Vision 2030 is a military transformation program that is one of the most ambitious defense industrialization projects in the modern world. The core target is blunt and unapologetic. Saudi Arabia wants to produce 50% of its own military equipment inside the kingdom by 2030. That means 50% of the weapons, the ammunition, the vehicles, the missiles, the drones, made in Saudi Arabia by Saudi hands using Saudi technology. When MBS announced this in 2016, almost nobody believed it was achievable. In 2018, local military production accounted for just 4% of defense needs. 4%. The challenge was almost incomprehensible. But by 2024, that number had climbed to nearly 20%. Still short of the target, but the trajectory is undeniable. The kingdom is building defense factories at a pace that has stunned Western defense analysts. Saudi Arabian Military Industries, known as SAMI, has grown into one of the most aggressive state-owned defense companies in the world. SAMI is not just assembling foreign-designed weapons under license. It is developing electronic warfare systems, unmanned aerial vehicles, armored vehicles, ammunition, and naval systems with increasing levels of domestic engineering content. The money behind this effort is staggering. Saudi Arabia's military budget reached $75.8 billion in 2024, according to official estimates. The Stockholm International Peace Research Institute put the figure slightly higher at $80.3 billion, making Saudi Arabia the seventh largest military spender on the entire planet, just barely behind the United Kingdom. For 2025, the kingdom has allocated $78 billion to defense, representing 21% of total government spending. This is not a country slowly trimming its reliance on foreign weapons. This is a country sprinting towards self-sufficiency with the full force of its oil wealth behind it. And critically, Saudi Arabia is now refusing to buy weapons from just one source. The old model was simple. Go to Washington, buy whatever America was willing to sell, accept the conditions that came with the purchase. That model is dead. Riyadh is now shopping the entire global arms market with a level of deliberate diversification that is sending shockwaves through defense ministries from Paris to Seoul to Madrid. In February 2024, Saudi Arabia signed a deal worth $3.2 billion to purchase the Cheonggung-2 air defense system from South Korea. This is a sophisticated medium-range air defense missile system, and it is emphatically not American. It sits alongside the Patriot systems that the kingdom operates, but it sends a clear message. Riyadh is no longer willing to depend on American-made air defense as its only option. Having multiple systems from multiple countries gives Saudi Arabia something it has never had before, genuine leverage. Washington can no longer use the threat of withholding weapons or spare parts as a pressure tool when the Saudis have alternatives lined up. Then there are the naval deals. In December 2024, Spanish shipbuilder Navantia signed a contract to build 3 Avante 2200 corvettes for the Royal Saudi Navy. These are modern warships that will significantly expand Saudi Arabia's ability to operate in the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea without relying on American naval cover. The deal includes crew training and integrated logistics support. The Saudis are not just buying ships, they are buying knowledge, absorbing expertise, building the human capability to maintain and operate advanced naval vessels independently. The fighter jet situation tells perhaps the most revealing story of all about where Saudi Arabia's military ambitions are headed. For years, Riyadh had been trying to purchase 48 Eurofighter Typhoon jets from the consortium that builds them, a European aircraft deliberately chosen to reduce dependence on American F-15s and F-16s. But Germany, one of the consortium members, repeatedly blocked the sale over human rights concerns related to the Yemen war. The Germans were, in effect, using their position inside a European arms deal to exercise a foreign policy veto over Saudi Arabia's defense procurement. Saudi Arabia's response was to walk away from the Eurofighter entirely and submit a formal request in October 2023 for 54 Rafale F-4 fighter jets from France's Dassault Aviation. French-made, outside American control, outside German veto, the kingdom was finding a path around every roadblock Washington and its allies tried to place in its way. Now add to all of this what happened in May 2025 when Donald Trump flew to Riyadh. The visit was heralded as a massive reaffirmation of the U.S. and Saudi relationship. There was a record-breaking $142 billion defense sales deal announced. On the surface, this looked like proof that America still dominated Saudi Arabia's military supply chain. But the reality beneath the surface told a very different story. Mohammed bin Salman had gone into those meetings with a specific, concrete demand. He wanted a formal mutual defense treaty, a binding, legally enforceable commitment from the United States that said if Saudi Arabia is attacked, America will come to its defense. The same kind of guarantee that NATO members enjoy. The same kind of commitment that would have made Abqaiq impossible for Iran to attempt. This was the one thing MBS needed from Washington to genuinely anchor the relationship. He did not get it. Trump and the administration were not willing to commit American military force to defending Saudi Arabia as a treaty obligation. Instead, they got the arms deal, a transactional arrangement that benefits American defense manufacturers and brings Saudi investment into the U.S. economy. Saudi Arabia got weapons. It did not get guarantees. And in that gap between what Riyadh asked for and what Washington delivered lies the entire explanation for Saudi Arabia's accelerating push toward military independence. Because when Trump publicly told the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, that America keeps them safe, the tone was not reassuring. The tone was the tone of a protection racket. Pay us, buy our weapons, and we will keep you safe. That is not an alliance. That is a transaction. And MBS had already decided that transactions are not enough when your national survival is on the line. So in September 2025, Saudi Arabia signed a defense pact that shocked analysts around the world. The Saudi-Pakistan Strategic Mutual Defense Agreement, signed on the 17th of September 2025, is something entirely without precedent in modern Gulf security architecture. The agreement contains a clause directly inspired by NATO's Article 5. If one country is attacked, the other will treat it as an attack on itself. Pakistan would come to Saudi Arabia's defense, and Saudi Arabia would come to Pakistan's defense. But the truly seismic element of this agreement is what Pakistan brought to the table. Pakistan is a nuclear power that never signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Pakistan's Defense Minister Khawaja Asif confirmed publicly that under this pact, if Saudi Arabia faced an existential threat, Pakistan's nuclear capabilities would be available to the kingdom. Saudi Arabia, a country that has long been suspected of wanting nuclear deterrence capability, has now effectively placed itself under a nuclear umbrella without having to develop a single nuclear weapon of its own. This is strategic genius of the highest order. Washington was caught completely off guard. The Pakistan deal represents exactly the kind of binding security guarantee that America refused to provide. And Saudi Arabia went out and found it elsewhere. The message to Washington could not have been clearer if MBS had written it in fire across the Riyadh skyline. If you will not commit to us, we will find someone who will. The China dimension of this transformation is equally important and equally carefully managed. Saudi Arabia has been deliberately drawing China closer on economic and diplomatic fronts, while maintaining studied ambiguity on the military side. In March 2023, it was China that brokered the historic Saudi-Iran diplomatic normalization, the deal that ended years of severed relations between Riyadh and Tehran. The fact that this happened through Beijing rather than Washington was a public, deliberate signal that China now plays a legitimate role in Middle Eastern affairs, a role that was once exclusively American. Saudi Arabia signed a comprehensive strategic partnership agreement with China. Chinese investment is flowing into Vision 2030 projects. Saudi oil exports to China now represent more than a quarter of the kingdom's total hydrocarbon sales. China is Saudi Arabia's largest trading partner. The economic ties are deep, growing, and deliberately nurtured as a counterweight to American leverage. On the military side, Saudi Arabia has acquired Chinese-made ballistic missiles and has allowed Chinese defense companies to participate in joint ventures inside the kingdom. Between roughly 2014 and 2023, Saudi Arabia received nearly 150 military systems from China, including missiles, drones, and radar technology. These are not flagship weapons. They are not the main battle tanks or the fighter jets, but they serve a strategic purpose that has nothing to do with their battlefield utility. They ensure that China has a stake in Saudi Arabia's defense architecture, giving Riyadh another card to play in its conversations with Washington. Because the Saudi strategy is not about replacing America with China, it is far more sophisticated than a straight substitution. The strategy is to ensure that Saudi Arabia never again has only one option. When you have only one arms supplier, that supplier owns you. When you have 4 or 5 suppliers across multiple continents, you own the relationship. You decide what you buy, from whom, on what terms. You cannot be pressured through weapons withheld or spare parts delayed because you can walk down the street and knock on a different door. Saudi Arabia is engineering its military procurement to make itself uncoercible, and it is working. The numbers from public opinion research inside the kingdom add another layer to this story. In a 2022 poll, for the first time in the decade that these surveys had been running, Saudi citizens ranked China and Russia as more important partners than the United States. 61% of Saudis said they felt they could not rely on America, and that the kingdom should look more to Russia or China. This is not just elite policy calculation. It is a genuine shift in how an entire population perceives its relationship with the world's superpower. And those public attitudes give MBS political cover to make moves that previous Saudi rulers might have feared would anger Washington. The establishment of the General Authority for Military Industries in 2017 was a foundational moment in this transformation. GAMI is the regulatory and promotional body that oversees the entire Saudi defense industrial ecosystem. Its mandate is to attract international defense investment, build local manufacturing capacity, develop Saudi engineering talent, and create the conditions for genuine military-industrial self-sufficiency. GAMI has been extraordinarily active, signing technology transfer agreements with dozens of foreign defense companies, creating joint ventures that bring manufacturing processes inside Saudi borders, and building vocational and technical training programs that are producing a new generation of Saudi defense engineers. The Raytheon partnership tells this story in miniature. Raytheon, now called RTX Corporation, agreed as part of the 2025 defense framework to support the production, assembly, and testing of Patriot air defense system components inside Saudi Arabia. They will train Saudi technicians to manage, repair, and operate these systems. This is not Saudi Arabia simply buying American Patriot missiles anymore. This is Saudi Arabia acquiring the capability to build and maintain Patriot missile components domestically. Every technology transfer deal like this chips away at dependence. Each new local capability means one less lever Washington can pull. The Women in Defense program launched by Saudi Arabian military industries in 2024 is one of the more surprising signals of how serious Riyadh is about building genuine domestic capability rather than just performing industrial nationalism for public relations purposes. Saudi women are now being trained and employed in defense engineering, technical roles, and leadership positions within the defense sector. This is not unrelated to the broader Vision 2030 social liberalization agenda, but it is very specifically also about expanding the talent pool available to build Saudi Arabia's military industries. The kingdom simply cannot hit its localization targets without dramatically expanding the number of technically trained Saudis working in defense. Including women is not idealism, it is necessity. And necessity, in MBS's Saudi Arabia, tends to override everything else. The defense localization program is projected to generate 60,000 indirect jobs inside the kingdom by the end of the decade. Think about what that means. 60,000 Saudis whose livelihoods depend on the continued growth of domestic defense manufacturing. That creates an enormous domestic political constituency for continued military independence. Once you have 60,000 families whose economic well-being is tied to locally made weapon systems, the pressure to maintain foreign supply chains instead becomes much harder to justify politically. MBS is not just building factories, he is building irreversibility. The Yemen war, for all its terrible human cost, has also functioned as an unplanned but intense testing ground for Saudi Arabia's military capabilities. It exposed weakness, the inability to rapidly adapt tactics, the dependence on American intelligence and targeting support, the vulnerability to cheap drone and missile attacks. But it also accelerated learning. Saudi Arabia invested heavily in drone technology and counter-drone systems, specifically because of Yemen. The Houthi threat made abstract vulnerability very concrete. And that concrete vulnerability drove procurement decisions, training investments, and technology acquisitions at a pace that a peacetime military modernization program never would have achieved. The Hoover Institution captured the military transformation bluntly when it noted in late 2025 that Riyadh is investing billions in indigenous missile defense, drones, and naval capabilities designed to shoulder more of the deterrence burden, and that this represents leverage without liability for the United States, influence maintained through partnership, rather than permanent deployment. Even American strategic thinkers who want to maintain the relationship are acknowledging that the terms have fundamentally changed. Saudi Arabia is no longer the junior partner asking Washington for protection. It is becoming a military actor in its own right that chooses to cooperate with America on terms it negotiates rather than accepts. There is one more dimension to this story that almost never gets discussed in mainstream coverage, but is absolutely central to understanding why Saudi Arabia is so determined to build military independence. It is the Palestinian question and the Gaza conflict that erupted in late 2023. Saudi Arabia had been moving carefully toward normalization with Israel under intense American pressure. The Abraham Accords had brought the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan into formal peace with Israel. Saudi normalization was to be the crown jewel, the deal that would reshape the entire Middle East. Then came the devastation of Gaza, and Saudi Arabia's domestic audience, its religious establishment, its relationship with the broader Muslim world made any formal normalization with Israel politically impossible in the immediate term. America's staunch diplomatic and military support for Israel throughout the Gaza conflict created a profound tension with Saudi Arabia's own political constraints. Washington was asking Riyadh to normalize with Israel while simultaneously providing the weapons used in Gaza. MBS could not deliver normalization in that environment, even if he had wanted to. And Washington's insistence on linking Saudi security guarantees to Israel normalization effectively held the kingdom's security hostage to a political outcome that Saudi domestic politics made unavailable. Strategic analysts at War on the Rocks noted in December 2025 that Washington front-loaded sensitive technology cooperation, high-end defense sales, and upgraded security assurances without obtaining any Saudi commitment on normalization of relations with Israel. The Trump administration essentially abandoned the normalization precondition because Saudi capital was too important for American technology and manufacturing goals. But by that point, Saudi Arabia had already demonstrated that it would not be held hostage. The Pakistan nuclear deal had been signed. The diversification was accelerating. Riyadh had shown that it could find alternatives. What is emerging from all of this is a Saudi Arabia that is genuinely unprecedented in modern history. It is the first time in the kingdom's existence that Riyadh is building military capability rather than simply buying it. The first time Saudi defense policy is being driven by strategic autonomy rather than great power dependency. The first time the kingdom is sitting at a table with multiple superpowers simultaneously, buying American Patriot missiles, South Korean air defense systems, French fighter jets, Spanish naval vessels, Chinese drones, Pakistani nuclear cover, and playing them all against each other while owing ultimate allegiance to none. The Middle East Council on Global Affairs noted that the parameters of the U.S.-Saudi security relationship are gradually shifting. Riyadh is moving beyond simple acquisition and toward leveraging its key defense partners' capabilities to enhance its own. That sentence sounds diplomatic and measured, but what it actually describes is a revolution. Saudi Arabia is no longer acquiring American military power. It is extracting American military knowledge and adding it to a sovereign industrial base that will eventually not need to buy from America at all. This does not mean Saudi Arabia and the United States are enemies. They are not. The $142 billion arms deal signed in May 2025 remains the largest single defense sales agreement in American history. There are still American training missions inside the kingdom. There are still deep intelligence sharing relationships. There are still American contractors embedded throughout the Saudi military establishment. The relationship continues. But the nature of the relationship has been fundamentally transformed. America used to be the foundation of Saudi security. Now it is one supplier among several, one partner in a diversified portfolio, one option among many. The leverage has shifted, the dependency has dissolved, and that shift was not forced on Saudi Arabia from outside. It was chosen, deliberately and systematically, by a crown prince who looked at the burning facilities at Abqaiq in 2019 and decided that a kingdom that cannot protect itself has no future. Mohammed bin Salman is building an army, an air force, a navy, a defense industry, a nuclear guarantee, and a network of alliances that will eventually be capable of defending Saudi Arabia, regardless of what Washington decides to do or not do. He's doing it with Saudi money, Saudi technology partnerships, Saudi industrial ambition, and Saudi diplomatic skill. And he is doing it faster than anyone thought possible just a decade ago. The world is watching a kingdom that was once the most dependent of American clients becoming one of the most strategically autonomous nations on Earth. It is happening quietly, through factory openings and defense budgets and arms procurement announcements that rarely make front-page news. But the cumulative effect of all these individual moves is nothing less than a seismic shift in the military architecture of the most consequential region on the planet. Saudi Arabia is not purging American influence out of anger. It is not doing it out of anti-Western ideology. It is doing it out of cold, rational, survival-driven calculation. A calculation that started when the drones hit Abqaiq and America looked the other way. A calculation that is now written into every defense contract Riyadh signs with Seoul, Paris, and Islamabad. A calculation that says, quite simply, we will never again need anyone else's permission to defend ourselves. The kingdom built on oil is building something new on top of that oil, something that does not need to ask for anyone's protection, something that will be here long after the oil runs out. And whether Washington chooses to acknowledge this transformation or not, it is already happening. The walls are going up, the factories are running, the missiles are being built at home, and the age of Saudi military dependency is coming to an end, not with a war, not with a revolution, but with a receipt. A long, expensive, methodical receipt for a military Saudi Arabia is finally building for itself.